The morning of December 6, 1942, 27,000 feet above the industrial city of Lille, France. Colonel Curtis Emerson LeMay sat in the lead bomber of 18 B-17 flying fortresses, arranged in a formation that had never been flown in combat before. Below him, through breaks in the cloud cover, he could see the locomotive works that were their target. Around him, in a staggered three-dimensional pattern that had taken weeks to perfect on paper and in training, flew 17 other bombers, their wings so close to each other that pilots fought continuously against the turbulent air churned up by their neighbors' propellers. Each aircraft carried 10 men, each aircraft bristled with guns. Together, they formed something unprecedented in aerial warfare, a single, integrated weapon system composed of 180 heavy machine guns, positioned with mathematical precision to create interlocking fields of fire that covered every approach angle. German fighter pilots were already climbing to intercept them. From their cockpits, the Americans could see the distant specks growing larger, resolving into the distinctive silhouettes of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190 fighters, veterans from the Eastern Front, pilots who had been flying in combat since the Spanish Civil War, men with dozens of kills, some with over 100. The Germans saw what appeared to be an opportunity. These American bombers were flying in a tight, rigid cluster, unable to maneuver, locked into their formation like targets in a shooting gallery. The Luftwaffe pilots pushed their throttles forward and dove in for the kill. They had no way of knowing they were diving into a mathematical death trap that would transform them from predators into prey. They had no way of knowing this formation would come to haunt their nightmares, the formation they would learn to call Fliegendes Stachelschwein, the flying porcupine. What happened in the sky above Lille that December morning would fundamentally change the nature of aerial combat over Europe. It would prove that survival in the most hostile airspace ever created by human beings required not individual skill or bravery, but something far more difficult. Perfect discipline, unbreakable trust, and the willingness to surrender all personal initiative to mathematics and formation flying. The Americans would discover that to defend themselves, they had to fly so close together that a single mistake could kill their own men as surely as enemy fire. The Germans would discover that attacking massed American bombers was not like anything they had experienced before. This is the story of how the combat box, a formation built on calculated risk and geometric precision, turned 700 defensive machine guns into a weapon that could fill the sky with fire. And how the man who invented it earned his nickname not by sitting behind a desk, but by leading every mission from the most dangerous position in the sky. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. In August of 1942, the United States Army Air Forces launched its first heavy bomber mission over occupied Europe. 12 B-17 flying fortresses from the 97th Bombardment Group took off from English soil bound for the railroad marshalling yards at Rouen-Sotteville in France. The date was August 17th, exactly 5 years to the day before LeMay would lead the devastating raid on Regensburg that would cost 24 bombers and 240 men. But on that bright August morning in 42, optimism ran high. The B-17 had been designed specifically for this mission, penetrating deep into enemy territory in daylight, delivering precision bombing with the classified Norden bombsight, and fighting its way home without fighter escort. The doctrine was simple, and had been taught at the Air Corps Tactical School since the 1930s. Massed heavy bombers, bristling with defensive armament, could defeat any fighter opposition through coordinated crossfire from their machine guns. The Rouen mission seemed to confirm this belief. Escorted the entire distance by 4 squadrons of Royal Air Force Spitfires, the 12 fortresses bombed their target with half the bombs landing in the target area. Only one aircraft sustained minor damage, unrelated to enemy action. At mission debrief, commanders nodded with satisfaction. The flying fortress had earned its name. The theory appeared sound. They were catastrophically wrong. Within weeks, as American bomber formations ventured deeper into occupied territory, beyond the range of fighter escorts, the terrible reality became impossible to ignore. B-17 seconds were being shot down at rates that threatened to make the entire daylight bombing campaign unsustainable. A survey conducted by the Army Air Forces in 1943 would reveal a statistic that should have been obvious from the start. Over half of the bombers shot down by German fighters had left the protection of the main formation. The problem was not the aircraft itself. The B-17 could absorb punishment that would shred other planes and still bring its crew home. Stories circulated of fortresses returning with wings holed by flak, fuselages riddled with hundreds of bullet holes, tail sections barely attached, engines dead, and yet they flew. One bomber, just a snap-in from the 100th Bomb Group, returned from a raid on Bremen in October of '43 with more than 800 holes in its airframe. Maintenance personnel stopped counting. The crew had crash-landed in a field after hitting a tree, and every man walked away alive. No, the aircraft was not the problem. The problem was doctrine. The problem was how they were flying. Those early missions in the autumn of '42 used 6-plane squadrons, spread 4 miles apart. The thinking appeared logical on paper. Disperse to avoid mid-air collisions among inexperienced crews, give them room to breathe, prevent cascading failures if one plane went down. But spread across the sky like that, the bombers could not support each other. Their defensive machine guns, individually formidable, became isolated weapons with gaps in coverage that enemy fighters exploited with ruthless efficiency. And the German pilots they faced were not inexperienced recruits. These were professionals. Men who had been flying in combat since 1936 over Spain, since '39 over Poland, since '40 over France and the Channel. Fighter aces with 50, 70, 100 kills marked on their rudders. They had learned their trade shooting down Polish PZL fighters, French Morane Saulniers, British Hurricanes. They knew every weakness of the bomber, every blind spot in its defensive fire. The Luftwaffe tactics were brutally effective. They would surround a bomber formation, attacking simultaneously from multiple vectors, diving attacks from above and behind, head-on passes at closing speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, beam attacks from the sides where the bombers' waist guns had limited fields of fire. They targeted stragglers, first damaged planes limping behind on fewer than 4 engines, aircraft that had broken formation to avoid flak, any bomber separated from its fellows by more than a few hundred yards. One German pilot described it with clinical precision. The size of the heavy bombers and their formations could not be adequately described to a green pilot. They had to be experienced firsthand. But a single bomber, or 2 or 3 separated from the others. Those were dead men. The bomber gunners could not track us properly when their aircraft was alone. They could not create the crossfire that made formation flying so dangerous for us. A lone bomber was simply target practice. From their perspective, the term mathematics were simple. A B-17 inches, the early variants, carried 9 defensive machine guns, 2 in a dorsal turret behind the cockpit, 2 in a ball turret under the belly, 2 waist guns firing from the sides, 1 tail gun, and a pair in the nose. 9 guns sounds formidable, but each gun could only fire in a limited arc. The dorsal turret could not depress below the horizontal plane of the aircraft. The ball turret had blind spots above. The tail gunner could only fire aft. A skilled fighter pilot could identify these blind spots and exploit them, staying just outside the cone of defensive fire while pouring 20mm cannon shells into the bomber's engines, cockpit, or fuel tanks. The early losses were staggering. On September 6, 1943, 400 bombers were sent to attack a ball-bearing plant in Schweinfurt. 45 were lost, more than 11%. On October 14th of that same year, 291 B-17 seconds returned to Schweinfurt. 60 bombers failed to return, more than 20% losses. That mission would be remembered as Black Thursday, the day that nearly broke the American daylight bombing campaign. According to official Army Air Forces statistics, between 1942 and August of 1945, more than 22,000 aircraft were lost on combat missions against the Axis powers in Europe. An additional 20,000 were lost to non-combat causes, mechanical failures, weather, training accidents, operational mistakes. From 1942 onward, America averaged 170 planes lost per day. not per week, per day. The mathematics of survival were brutal and unforgiving. A bomber crew's tour of duty consisted of 25 missions. In late 1942 and through 1943, before the implementation of the combat box and the arrival of long-range escort fighters, loss rates on some missions exceeded 10%. 10% losses meant that statistically, a crew would not survive their tour. They would be killed, captured, or severely wounded before completing 25 missions. Bomber crewmen in the 8th Air Force suffered a higher casualty rate than Marines landing on Pacific beaches. The young men who flew these missions understood the mathematics. They saw the empty bunks in the barracks after each mission. They attended memorial services for crews who had been joking at breakfast and were dead by afternoon. They knew the odds, and they kept flying. But the High Command knew something had to change. The daylight precision bombing campaign, the centerpiece of American air strategy in Europe, was unsustainable at these loss rates. The solution would not come from headquarters planners or academic theorists. It would come from a 36-year-old colonel who believed three things with absolute conviction: that relentless training was the key to survival, that most problems could be solved through mathematical analysis and engineering discipline, and that a commander's place was in the lead aircraft of the most dangerous missions. Curtis Emerson LeMay had been born in Columbus, Ohio, in November of 1906. His father was an ironworker and handyman who never held a job longer than a few months. The family moved constantly, following work, struggling with poverty. Young Curtis learned early that survival depended on self-reliance, determination, and the ability to do difficult things well. He attended Ohio State University, studying civil engineering, a discipline that would shape his approach to aerial warfare. Engineering taught him to see problems as equations to be solved, systems to be analyzed, processes to be optimized. He joined the Army Air Corps as a flying cadet in 1928 and received his commission as a second lieutenant in 1929. His first assignment was with the 27th Pursuit Squadron at Selfridge Field, Michigan, flying Boeing P-12 biplane fighters. But LeMay quickly concluded that fighters, while exciting to fly, were essentially defensive weapons. Future wars, he believed, would be won by offensive weapons, by bombers. He transferred to bomber aircraft in 1937. What set LeMay apart from other pilots was his obsessive attention to every aspect of aviation. When the opportunity arose to learn celestial navigation, considered an esoteric specialty at the time, he mastered it. When instrument flying training became available, he logged more good time than anyone else in his unit, teaching himself to fly by instruments alone in all weather conditions. He studied mechanical systems, electrical systems, hydraulics. He learned to be not just a pilot, but a navigator, bombardier, and engineer. In August of 1937, flying as navigator under pilot Caleb Haynes in a B-17, LeMay helped locate the battleship USS Utah in exercises off the California coast, despite being given incorrect coordinates by Navy personnel. The exercises were conducted in heavy mist. Most of the other aircraft failed to find the target. LeMay's bomber found it and delivered a simulated attack with water bombs that would have sunk the battleship. The demonstration proved that land-based bombers could defend America's coastlines, a revolutionary concept at the time when the Navy insisted only carriers could project power at sea. In May of 1938, navigating for Haynes again, LeMay took 3 B-17 seconds, 620 nautical miles over the Atlantic Ocean to intercept the Italian liner SS Rex. The purpose was to demonstrate that land-based aircraft could defend American shores far out to sea. They found the Rex exactly where and when LeMay had calculated they would. The newspapers called it a miracle of navigation. For LeMay, it was simply mathematics applied correctly. These achievements earned him recognition as one of the finest navigators in the Air Corps. But navigation was only one of his skills. He was also developing a reputation as a demanding, uncompromising commander who believed that perfect execution under stress came only from relentless training. "You fight as you train," he would say repeatedly. It became one of his cardinal rules. He believed that in the chaos and terror of combat, Men would perform successfully only if their individual actions had become instinctive through repetitive drilling. By December of 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, LeMay was a major. He had been a first lieutenant as recently as 1940. War brought rapid promotion and increased responsibility. In June of 1942, LeMay was given command of a newly formed B-17 unit, the 305th Bombardment Group. He took command at Salt Lake City, knowing he faced a nearly impossible task. He was the only pilot in the entire group who had ever flown a B-17. Years later, he would recall with characteristic bluntness, "My greatest worry was that I didn't have any confidence in their commander me." But LeMay did what LeMay always did. He drilled them. Hour after hour, day after day, week after week. Formation, flying, navigation, bombing runs, instrument procedures, emergency protocols. Over and over until the crews could execute them unconscious, exhausted, terrified, under fire. When his men were not flying missions, they were training. When they complained about the relentless pace, LeMay's response was simple. "I don't mind being called tough, since I find in this racket it's the tough guys who lead the survivors." And LeMay practiced what he preached. He flew in every position in the bomber except ball gunner. His frame was too large for that cramped space. He learned every station, every job, every vulnerability. He experienced firsthand what his crews faced. He could pilot, navigate, operate the radios, man the guns, drop the bombs. This was not theoretical knowledge. He knew the aircraft intimately. In October of 1942, LeMay led the 305th across the North Atlantic to England. The Atlantic crossing itself was hazardous. The Army Air Forces had expected to lose 10% of the 920 planes making the transit. The actual loss rate was 5.2%, but every one of those planes represented 10 men, most of them killed in crashes on the ice fields of Greenland or lost in the freezing waters between Newfoundland and Iceland. The 305th set up at Royal Air Force Station Grafton-Underwood in Northamptonshire, then moved to RAF Chelveston in December. From these bases, LeMay would begin the process of solving the problem that was killing American air crews at unsustainable rates. The problem of how to survive in the most lethal airspace human beings had ever created. LeMay's first innovation seemed insane to his crews. He ordered his bombardiers to fly long, straight bomb runs from the initial point to the target without any evasive maneuvers, no jinking to avoid flak, no course changes, straight and level, holding altitude and heading precisely, while German anti-aircraft batteries fired at them and they could do nothing but fly into the bursting shells. The crew thought he had lost his mind. Flying straight through flak was suicide. Everyone knew you were supposed to jink and weave, present a harder target, make the gunner's calculations more difficult. LeMay listened to their objections and then explained his reasoning with the engineer's cold logic that would characterize his entire career. Yes, he acknowledged, flying straight through flak increased vulnerability during that specific window of time. But the math was simple. Evasive maneuvers scattered bombs across the countryside instead of concentrating them on the target. Scattered bombs meant missing the target. Missing the target meant having to come back again. And again. And again, until you finally destroyed the target or died trying. Each return trip meant another gauntlet through enemy fighters, another run through flak fields, another roll of the dice where the only possible outcomes were survival or death. But accurate bombing on the first pass that meant you knocked out the target and never had to go back. The total exposure to danger was less, even accounting for the increased risk during the bomb run itself. LeMay had done mathematics. A longer bomb run with higher immediate risk but higher accuracy resulted in fewer overall casualties than repeated missions with lower immediate risk but scattered bombing. To prove his point, LeMay did what he would always do when asking his men to face death. He led from the front. In November of 1942, he piloted the lead aircraft on a mission to Saint-Nazaire, France. The 305th executed a long, straight bomb run without evasive action. LeMay later recalled, "It was the first time in the Army Air Force's European theatre experience that a large formation of heavy bombers had ever approached a target without using evasive action in an attempt to avoid the enemy's ground-to-air shellfire. I led that one. So I suffered and wondered right there. The results validated his calculations. The 305th hit twice as many targets as any other group on that mission without losing a single bomber. In the missions that followed, the group continued to lead in target destruction. They suffered some losses. No tactical innovation could eliminate casualties entirely, but consistently fewer than other groups using evasive maneuvers. As 8th Air Force Commander General Ira Eaker came under increasing pressure from Army Air Forces Commander General Henry Hap Arnold to show results, LeMay's straight bombing tactic gradually became standard procedure across the 8th. It worked because the mathematics was sound. But straight bombing only solved half the problem. The real problem was that bombers were still being shot down by German fighters at unacceptable rates. The straight bomb run increased accuracy, but it did nothing to protect the aircraft from Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. For that, LeMay needed to solve a different problem entirely. He began by studying the defensive armament of the B-17, with the same methodical attention to detail he had brought to every other aspect of flying. Each gun on the bomber had a specific field of fire, an arc of sky it could cover. The dorsal turret could rotate 360 degrees horizontally and elevate significantly, but could not depress below the aircraft's horizontal plane. The ball turret under the belly had excellent fields of fire below and to the sides, but limited coverage above. The waist guns could fire to the sides and had some ability to track targets above and below, but their fields of fire were constrained by the aircraft's own structure. The tail gunner had the best field of fire directly aft, but could not engage targets approaching from the sides or front until they had already passed the aircraft. Each gun, considered individually, left blind spots that a skilled fighter pilot could exploit. But LeMay realized that if you arranged multiple aircraft in a precise three-dimensional formation, you could make those blind spots disappear. A fighter pilot attacking from an angle that put him in one aircraft's blind spot would find himself in the fields of fire of 2 or 3 other aircraft in the formation. The mathematics was elegant. If Bomber A's dorsal turret could not depress to engage a fighter attacking from below and behind, but Bomber B, flying at a lower altitude and offset to the side, had that fighter perfectly positioned for its ball turret, then the fighter was still under fire, even though he had found Bomber A's blind spot. Stack enough aircraft vertically, stagger them horizontally with the right spacing, and you could create a formation where every possible approach angle was covered by multiple guns, from multiple aircraft. The formation had to be tight enough that the fields of fire overlapped, but it also had to be loose enough that pilots could hold position without colliding in turbulent air. Too tight and you would kill your own men through mid-air collisions. Too loose and the gaps in coverage would reappear. LeMay spent hours with diagrams, calculating angles and distances, working out the geometry. He called his formation the javelin down because squadrons were stacked downward in the direction of the sun, with the highest aircraft positioned between the sun and the lower aircraft. This configuration helped gunners on the higher bombers see lower aircraft without glare blindness. From above, the formation looked like a spear point. From the front, it resembled a set of stairs descending into the distance. The basic unit was an 18-plane group composed of 3 6-plane squadrons, a lead squadron in the center, a high squadron above and to one side, and a low squadron below and to the other side. Within each squadron, aircraft were arranged in elements of 2 or 3 planes, stacked vertically and staggered horizontally. The vertical separation between aircraft was 150 feet. The horizontal stagger was calculated to prevent bomb collisions during the drop while maintaining overlapping fields of fire. On paper, it was brilliant. In practice, it would require flying skills that pushed even experienced pilots to their limits. Maintaining formation meant flying in the turbulent prop wash of the aircraft ahead of you. It meant your wings were constantly being buffeted by invisible rivers of disturbed air. It meant fighting your controls continuously to hold altitude and heading, while tons of metal beside you and above you and below you flew so close that a moment's inattention could cause a collision that would kill everyone in both aircraft. And it meant you could never break formation. If fighters attacked from your most vulnerable angle, you could not maneuver. If flak burst around you, you could not evade. You had to hold position and trust that the mathematical perfection of the formation would keep you alive. You had to trust the pilots around you to hold their positions as precisely as you held yours. One pilot breaking formation out of panic or fatigue or damaged controls could create a gap that the Germans would exploit to slaughter the entire group. LeMay knew his men would resist this. Everything in human instinct screams to evade when someone is shooting at you. Every pilot's training emphasized maneuverability, the ability to turn and climb and dive to avoid threats. LeMay was asking them to deliberately give up that ability. He was asking them to fly into fire and hold formation while death burst around them. He called a meeting with his squadron commanders and pilots. He explained the concept. He showed them the calculations. And then he told them what they needed to hear. I'll be in the lead bomber on the first mission. If this works, you'll know it works because I'll be alive to tell you. If it doesn't work, you'll have a new group commander. The date for the first combat test of the formation was set for December 6, 1942. The target was the locomotive works at Lille, France. 18 B-17 seconds would fly in LeMay's new combat box. If it worked, they would hit the target accurately and return with minimal losses. If it failed, the formation would come apart under fire and they would suffer the same casualties as every other group or worse. The weather on the morning of December 6th was cold and clear. The crews assembled for briefing at 0400 hours, emerging from their quarters in the pre-dawn darkness. They filed into the briefing room and sat on wooden benches facing the covered map board at the front. When the intelligence officer pulled back the cover, revealing the red yarn that marked their route to target and back, there was the usual mix of reactions, nervous jokes, silent contemplation, a few prayers. They had flown enough missions to know that some of them would not come back. LeMay was already in his flight gear. He explained the formation one last time, the positions, the spacing, the absolute necessity of holding formation no matter what happened. If someone breaks formation and gets killed, he said, that's on him. If someone breaks formation and gets someone else killed because he created a gap in our defensive fire, that's on me for not making this clear enough. So I'm making it clear now. You stay in formation. You stay in formation if your engines are on fire. You stay in formation if you're taking hits. You stay in formation until I give the order to brake, or until you physically cannot keep the aircraft in the air. Is that understood? The bombers took off in the darkness and climbed through the British cloud deck, emerging into crystal air at 20,000 feet. Assembly into formation took the better part of an hour. 18 aircraft, positioning themselves with geometric precision, using visual reference to each other and to the assembly ship, a war-weary B-17 painted in distinctive colours that led them through the process. Gradually, the formation took shape. Lead squadron in the centre, high squadron up and to the right, low squadron down and to the left. Within each squadron, the elements stacked and staggered according to LeMay's calculations. From inside any one aircraft, the formation looked impossibly close. Pilots could see the rivets on the wings of neighbouring bombers. Waist gunners could look across 100 feet of empty air and make eye contact with gunners in other aircraft. The turbulence was constant. Wings flexed and bent in the disturbed air. Pilots gripped their control yokes and maintained position through continuous tiny corrections. They crossed the channel and entered French airspace. Below them, through gaps in the clouds, they could see the patchwork of fields and roads and villages. Somewhere down there, German radar operators were tracking them on their screens. Fighter controllers were scrambling interceptors. Flak batteries were calculating range and altitude. LeMay kept the formation steady. They approached Lille from the northwest, maintaining 27,000 feet. The locomotive works came into view, a complex of buildings and rail yards spread across several city blocks. This was the initial point. LeMay held the aircraft straight and level on the bombing run. No evasive action. Around him, the other 17 bombers held their positions. And then the fighters came. German fighter pilots had been alerted to the American formation while it was still assembling over England. Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s from nearby airfields had climbed to intercept. Looking down from 29,000 feet, the German pilots saw something unusual. Previous American raids had used spread-out formations where individual aircraft could maneuver. But this formation was different. These bombers were flying in a tight cluster, stacked vertically and staggered horizontally in a precise pattern. To the German pilots, it looked like an opportunity. The Americans were locked in formation. They could not maneuver. They were sitting ducks. The Germans pushed their throttles forward and dove for the kill. What they encountered was unlike anything they had experienced before. As the first fighters dove toward the formation, gunners in multiple aircraft acquired them simultaneously. The range of the American Browning .50 caliber machine gun was greater than the range of the German MG-17 machine guns. The muzzle velocity was higher. The American gunners opened fire at ranges where the Germans were not yet able to return effective fire. Tracer rounds arced across the sky, not from one or two guns, but from dozens. Every bomber in the formation that had a clear line of sight to an attacking fighter opened fire. The sky filled with tracers, lines of light that appeared solid, like streams of water from fire hoses. No gaps, no safe approach angles. Every direction a German pilot turned, he faced a wall of fire. One German pilot described it later. The bomber gunners opened fire as soon as a target was seen. The Americans' Browning 50-inch machine guns had a higher muzzle velocity and a greater range than our weapons. We could not get close enough to use our cannon effectively without flying through their defensive fire. And their fire was not scattered, it was concentrated, multiple aircraft tracking each target. It was unlike anything we had faced. The combat box was working exactly as LeMay had calculated. The geometric precision of the formation created overlapping fields of fire that covered every approach angle. A fighter attacking from above found himself under fire from the dorsal turrets of multiple bombers. A fighter attacking from below faced the ball turrets. Beam attacks from the sides were engaged by waist guns from several aircraft simultaneously. Even head-on attacks, which had become the Luftwaffe's preferred tactic because early B-17 variants had weak forward armament, now faced defensive fire from multiple nose positions across the entire formation. More critically, when one bomber's guns fell silent as the attacker passed out of that particular gunner's arc of fire, another bomber's guns immediately picked up the target. The coverage was seamless. There were no gaps, no blind spots, no safe approach. The Germans tried multiple attack vectors. They tried diving attacks from above. They tried climbing attacks from below. They tried head-on passes at closing speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. Every approach met the same response: concentrated defensive fire from dozens of machine guns. The formation held. Despite the stress, despite the fear, despite the turbulence and the tracers and the fighters, screaming past at impossible speeds, the American pilots maintained their positions. They did what LeMay had drilled into them through months of training. They flew the formation. The 305th reached the release point. Bombardiers in all 18 aircraft synchronized their drops with the lead bombardier. The bomb bay doors opened. The bombs fell. And then the formation turned for home, still holding position, still maintaining the defensive formation that had kept them alive. They landed back at Chelveston with minimal losses. Every crew that had taken off returned. The formation had worked. The mathematics had been proven in combat. Word spread quickly through the 8th Air Force. Within days, other bomb groups were requesting copies of LeMay's formation diagrams. By January of 1943, the combat box had become standard operating procedure. The 8th expanded on LeMay's basic concept, creating 21 plane formations with an additional element added to the most vulnerable squadron for additional support. This wedge-shaped configuration remained standard through September of 1943. But the Germans were learning too. They had faced the combat box and recognized that head-on attacks, while dangerous, remained the most effective approach, because early B-17 variants had only 2 guns firing forward from the nose. German fighter tactics evolved to exploit this vulnerability. Groups of fighters would form up ahead of the bomber stream, climb above it, then turn and dive directly at the lead aircraft in a head-on pass. The head-on attack required exceptional skill and courage. The fighter pilot had perhaps 2 seconds to aim, fire, and break away before a certain collision with several tons of bomber traveling at 180 miles per hour. The closing speed was over 500 miles per hour. Any hesitation, any miscalculation, and the fighter would plow directly into the bomber, killing everyone in both aircraft. But the best German pilots mastered this technique and used it to devastating effect. Hauptmann Fritz Geischardt, commander of the 3rd Group of Jagdgeschwader 26, learned the price of this tactic during an early encounter with a combat box formation. On one of his unit's first passes through an American formation, Geischardt's aircraft was hit by return fire from multiple bombers. A 50 caliber round half an inch in diameter and traveling at over 2,000 feet per second tore through his cockpit and his abdomen. He managed to control his aircraft long enough to land, but he was bleeding profusely. Medical personnel at the hospital at Ghent worked to save him, but the damage was too severe. He died early the next morning. The Germans began to call the American combat box Fliegendes Stachelschwein, the flying porcupine. One pilot described attacking a B-17 formation from behind as like trying to make love to a porcupine that is on fire. By spring of 1943, the Luftwaffe had adapted their tactics to focus on the head-on attack approach despite its dangers, and the Americans responded with the B-17G model, which entered service in the summer of '43. The G model added a chin turret with 2 50 caliber machine guns specifically designed to defend against frontal attacks. Combined with guns in the nose, the forward armament of the B-17G was formidable. The aircraft now carried 13 50 caliber machine guns total. As American bomber strength built through 1943, the combat box continued to evolve. Multiple 18-plane or 21-plane boxes were combined into larger wing formations. The wing box, as it came to be called, consisted of 3 staggered combat boxes arranged in 3 dimensions, a total of 54 bombers spread across 3,000 feet vertically, 7,000 feet fore and aft, and 2,000 feet laterally. 54 aircraft, each carrying 10 or 13 guns, approximately 700 heavy-caliber defensive machine guns in a single formation. The firepower density was staggering. A fighter pilot approaching this formation from any angle faced simultaneous fire from dozens of guns. The mathematics of probability worked against him. Even if most gunners missed, enough 50 caliber rounds filled the air that hits became inevitable. And a single 50 caliber hit could be catastrophic. The round could punch through an engine block, it could sever control cables, it could detonate fuel tanks, it could kill the pilot instantly, but maintaining the wing box required superhuman discipline and endurance. 54 bombers, each weighing 32 tons fully loaded, flying in formation through turbulence, through clouds, through flak fields where explosions could flip a 4-engine bomber inverted. Pilots in the rear positions of the formation fought constantly against turbulence, cascading backward from the lead aircraft. The physical strain was exhausting. The mental strain was worse. One mistake, one moment of inattention, and you could collide with the aircraft beside you, killing 20 men in an instant. And there was an additional horror that every crewman in the formation understood but rarely spoke about. Bombs from higher stacked aircraft could hit lower aircraft during the bomb run. The vertical stagger was calculated to minimize this risk, but it could not eliminate it entirely, not when you had 54 aircraft dropping hundreds of bombs simultaneously from different altitudes. On May 19, 1944, during a mission to Berlin, this nightmare became reality. A B-17 named Miss Donna May II from the 331st Bomb Squadron of the 94th Bomb Group was flying in a lower element of the formation. Above it, in a higher element, flew a B-17F named Trudy from the 332nd Bomber Squadron. At the bomb release point, the bombardiers in all aircraft toggled their releases, in rapid sequence. The bomb bays opened. 500-pound and 1,000-pound bombs began falling. Cameras in the bombers captured what happened next. A 1,000-pound ANM-65 bomb, released from Trudy, struck the left horizontal stabilizer of Miss Donna May II. The impact was captured in a sequence of photographs that would later be analyzed by accident investigators. The bomb, weighing 1,000 pounds and falling at terminal velocity, hit the stabilizer with devastating force. The tail section shattered, control cables severed. The bomber entered an immediate uncontrolled dive. All 10 crew members died. The bomber crashed in flames near Berlin. The photographs of the incident became part of official safety training, a reminder of the terrible price of formation flying. This was the central paradox of the combat box. It saved lives. Formations that held together survived at higher rates than dispersed formations. The statistics proved it. The combat box worked. But it also killed Americans, not through German action, but through the inherent risks of flying tons of metal and high explosives in close formation. The mathematics saved more men than it killed, but that was cold comfort to the families of the men who died not from enemy fire but from the random chance of a bomb falling through the formation. LeMay had been promoted to command of the 3rd Air Division by September of 1943. He no longer flew with the 305th, but the formation he had developed continued to be refined and expanded, and it would face its ultimate test on a mission that would nearly break the American daylight bombing campaign. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. October 14th, 1943. The date that would be remembered as Black Thursday. 291 B-17 flying fortresses of the 8th Air Force were preparing to attack the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, Germany. The target was critical to the German war effort. Ball bearings were essential components in tanks, aircraft, submarines, artillery, virtually every piece of military equipment. 5 factories in Schweinfurt produced over half of Germany's ball-bearing supply. Destroying them could cripple German production across multiple industries. But Schweinfurt was 430 miles inside occupied Europe, beyond the range of any Allied fighter escort. The P-47 Thunderbolts escorting the bombers could stay with them only to the German border. After that, the bombers would be alone, protected only by their combat box formations and their 700 machine guns. The Germans knew they were coming. Radar had tracked the formation from the moment it lifted off from English airfields. Over 1,100 German fighters, Messerschmitt 109s, Fokker-Wulf 190s, and heavy twin-engine Junkers 88s were fueled, armed, and waiting. Fighter controllers had hours to position their aircraft for the interception. As the American P-47 escorts reached the limit of their range over Belgium, they waggled their wings in farewell to the bomber crews and turned for home. The bomber crews watched their little friends depart and knew they were now alone over the most heavily defended airspace in Europe. The German attack was unprecedented in its magnitude and coordination. Single-engine fighters attacked head-on, 3 and 4 abreast, firing 20mm cannon at point-blank range before breaking away to avoid collision. Heavy Ju-88 fighters launched 21cm rockets from 1,000 yards out, safely beyond the range of the bombers' defensive fire. The rockets, each carrying a warhead with several pounds of high explosive, were intended not primarily to destroy bombers directly, though they could, but to break up the formations. If they could force individual bombers to break formation to evade the rockets, those aircraft became easy targets. The Luftwaffe had learned that the combat box's strength lay in its unity. Break the formation and you could slaughter the scattered individuals. The 305th Bombardment Group, LeMay's old unit, though he had been promoted to division command by then, lost 13 aircraft on Black Thursday, the heaviest loss of any group on the mission, not because they broke formation, not because they failed to execute the tactics. They held formation, they maintained discipline, they did everything right, and 13 bombers still went down. 130 men killed, wounded, or captured from a single group on a single mission. The bomber stream approached Schweinfurt through a corridor, flanked by German airfields on both sides. The Luftwaffe had positioned fighters to attack in waves. As one group of fighters exhausted their ammunition and broke away to land and rearm, another group was already climbing to altitude to continue the assault. The German pilots had time to land, refuel, rearm, and sortie again before the American bombers completed their mission and began the return flight. By the time the leading combat boxes reached Schweinfurt, they had already lost 28 aircraft. The formations that followed could track their route by the burning wrecks and the parachutes of men who had managed to bail out. Some bombers, too badly damaged to continue but still capable of flight, turned back toward England. Many of these stragglers were hunted down and destroyed by German fighters that specifically targeted damaged aircraft, limping alone across the countryside. Over the target itself, German flak batteries opened fire. The sky erupted in black bursts of 88mm shells. The combat boxes flew through this storm of steel fragments, maintaining their formations, maintaining their straight-line bomb runs, dropping their bombs. According to the technique LeMay had pioneered, the factories took heavy damage. Production would be disrupted for months, but the price was catastrophic. 60 B-17 seconds failed to return to England more than 20% losses. 5 more crashed on landing or were damaged beyond repair. 12 more were damaged so severely they would never fly combat missions again. 600 American airmen were dead, wounded, or prisoners of war. The numbers forced a brutal reckoning. Deep penetration missions beyond fighter escort range were suspended. At 20% losses, the mathematics of survival became impossible. No crew could complete a 25-mission tour. The losses were unsustainable. But the mission also proved something critical. The combat boxes that held formation, that maintained discipline despite the carnage around them, survived at higher rates than formations that broke apart. Of the 60 bombers lost, the majority had become separated from their formations through battle damage, mechanical failure, or crew decisions to break formation to evade threats. The Army Air Forces conducted extensive analysis of the mission. The conclusion was clear. The combat box worked as designed. The problem was not the formation. The problem was the lack of fighter escort. The solution appeared in early 1944, the North American P-51 Mustang fitted with drop tanks. The Mustang combined the range to escort bombers deep into Germany with the maneuverability and firepower to engage German fighters on equal terms. With full drop tanks, a P-51 could fly 1,000 miles to Berlin and back. For the first time, American bombers could attack any target in Germany with fighter escort the entire distance. The arrival of long-range fighters fundamentally changed the strategic balance over Europe. The combat box could now do what it was designed to do, concentrate defensive firepower and bombing accuracy, while friendly fighters screened the formations from German interceptors. By spring of 1944, the 8th Air Force was flying fighter sweeps ahead of the bomber formations, actively seeking out and destroying German fighters before they could reach the bombers. The combination proved devastating to the Luftwaffe. German fighters taking off to intercept American bombers now faced swarms of Mustangs and Thunderbolts, hunting them at every altitude. The Americans had numerical superiority, technological parity, and increasingly experienced pilots. Through much of 1944, the Luftwaffe sustained losses of 25% of air crews and 40% of aircraft per month. These were casualties they could not replace. The German pilot training program could not keep pace with losses. By late 1944, nearly half the pilots in German fighter squadrons had flown fewer than 200 hours total flight time. Contrast this with American pilots arriving in theatre, who typically had 300 to 400 hours of training before they saw combat. The disparity in experience that had favoured the Germans in 1942 and early 43 had completely reversed. The combat box evolved through this period. As flak became a greater threat than fighters by May of 1944, formations were loosened. The 54 plane wing box was replaced by 36 plane group boxes, arranged in looser configurations, that gave crews more room to manoeuvre around flak bursts. But the fundamental principle remained. Survival came from formation discipline, from crews willing to trust the mathematics and each other. The 305th Bombardment Group continued flying missions through the end of the war in Europe. They participated in the intensive campaign against German aircraft factories during Big Week in February of 1944. They supported the D-Day invasion in June, bombing German defensive positions and transportation networks. They struck V-weapon sites, oil refineries, and industrial complexes. They flew their last combat mission on April 25, 1945. Between November of 1942 and April of 45, the group flew more than 300 missions. 2 pilots from the 305th received the Medal of Honor. First Lieutenant William R. Lawley, Jr., received the medal for a mission on February 20, 1944, when his aircraft was severely damaged over Leipzig, but he managed to bring it back to England despite grievous wounds. First Lieutenant Edward S. Michael received the medal for a mission on April 11, 1944, when his bomber was hit by flak over Stettin, and he kept the aircraft in formation long enough for the bombardier to drop the bombs before crash landing in Sweden. When American ground forces captured Schweinfurt in April of 1945, they found a Nazi flag that had been flying over the city. It was presented to the 305th as a war trophy in recognition of the group's sacrifice during Black Thursday. 13 aircraft lost in a single mission, the heaviest loss of any group that day. The flag represented both victory and terrible cost. Curtis LeMay had been promoted to command of the 3rd Air Division in September of 1943. In August of 1944, he was transferred to the Pacific Theater to take command of strategic bombing operations against Japan. He took the combat box concept with him. The formation that had been developed for B-17 fortresses over Europe was adapted for B-29 superfortresses over Japan. The B-29 was a larger, faster, more complex aircraft than the B-17. It flew at higher altitudes, carried heavier bomb loads, and had greater defensive armament. But the fundamental principles of formation flying that LeMay had developed remained applicable. In the Pacific, LeMay would eventually shift to low-altitude night, incendiary attacks on Japanese cities, a controversial tactic that caused massive civilian casualties, but which LeMay believed was necessary to end the war without an invasion of Japan. But even these low-level missions used elements of formation flying to concentrate bombing effects. After the war, LeMay served in various command positions before being assigned to lead the United States Air Forces in Europe and organizing the Berlin airlift in 1948 when the Soviet Union blockaded West Berlin. He returned to the United States in 1948 to command Strategic Air Command, which he would lead for 9 years, transforming it from a collection of obsolete aircraft into the most powerful military force in history, an all-jet bomber and missile force capable of delivering nuclear weapons anywhere on Earth. He became Chief of Staff of the Air Force in 1961, serving until 1965. Throughout his career, he was known as demanding, uncompromising, and brilliant, a commander who led from the front, who did the mathematics, who believed that preparation and discipline were the keys to survival. Years later, asked about the success of the combat box over Europe, LeMay gave an answer characteristic of his engineering mindset. The box worked because it turned individual aircraft into a single weapon. You couldn't attack one bomber without attacking all of them. The math was simple. The Germans could never concentrate enough firepower at one point to overwhelm the entire formation. So we survived. But this simple statement concealed the profound human cost of making the math work. Between 1942 and the end of the war in Europe, the 8th Air Force suffered more than 47,000 casualties killed, wounded, or missing. Over 4,000 B-17s were lost in combat. Each bomber represented 10 men. Each loss meant 10 families receiving telegrams. Each mission meant young men most barely out, of their teens climbing into aircraft, knowing the statistical probability of their survival. The combat box saved countless lives. Formations that held discipline survived at dramatically higher rates than dispersed formations. The statistics proved it conclusively. But the formation also required men to accept their own vulnerability. It required them to fly close enough to touch, to surrender all ability to maneuver, to trust mathematics and their fellow pilots with their lives. And it required them to continue flying into fire, even when their friends were dying beside them. The crews who flew in these formations understood what they were doing. They saw the mathematics work. They saw formations that held together come home. They saw aircraft that broke formation get shot down. They knew that discipline saved lives, even when individual discipline sometimes cost their own life. They flew anyway. Consider the testimony of John "Lucky" Luckadoo, who served as a B-17 co-pilot and pilot with the 100th Bomb Group, the legendary Bloody 100th. He completed his tour of 25 missions between June and February of 1944, flying missions that included Bremen, known as Flak City, for the intensity of its anti-aircraft defences. He recalled missions where German fighters attacked from the moment they crossed into France and continued all the way to the target and back. He remembered flying through flak so thick you could taxi on it if you put your wheels down. He remembered seeing bombers explode in mid-air from direct flak hits. He remembered seeing B-17s with wings torn off, tails blown away, fuselages on fire, spiralling down trailing smoke, and he remembered the importance of formation discipline. You stayed with your group no matter what. That was the rule. If you were taking hits, if your engines were failing, if you were on fire, you stayed in formation as long as you could possibly fly the aircraft, because alone, you were dead. In formation, you had a chance. The combat box represents one of the central ironies of aerial warfare in World War II. The B-17 was called the Flying Fortress, designed to defend itself, built to penetrate enemy airspace without escort. Pre-war doctrine insisted that bombers could fight their way through to targets and back on their own strength. But survival came not from individual capability, but from collective vulnerability. Crews had to surrender their ability to maneuver, to evade, to make individual decisions about their own survival. They had to place their lives in the hands of pilots they might not even know, trusting that everyone would hold formation, that no one would break, that the mathematics of mutual protection would prove stronger than the human instinct for self-preservation. 700 machine guns arranged with geometric precision. 54 aircraft flying formations so tight that a single mistake could kill dozens. Young men, most of them 20 or 21 years old, with a few dozen hours of combat experience if they were lucky, flying into the most heavily defended airspace in human history. Doing it day after day, mission after mission, knowing that statistically many of them would not survive their tour. It worked because men like Curtis LeMay did the mathematics, drilled their crews relentlessly, and led from the front. It worked because thousands of Americans trusted that mathematics enough to climb into those bombers and fly into fire. It worked because human beings, when properly trained and properly led, are capable of extraordinary discipline under impossible stress. The Germans called it the flying porcupine. The Americans called it their only chance. Both were right. The combat box was not a perfect solution. No tactical innovation could eliminate the inherent dangers of aerial combat. Men still died. Aircraft still went down. The losses remained heavy through the entire campaign. But formations that maintained discipline survived at higher rates than those that did not. The statistics were unambiguous. The mathematics worked. And that mathematical certainty, cold and inhuman as it was, gave men the courage to continue flying. They knew that if they held formation, if they trusted the system, if they followed the procedures that LeMay and others had developed through analysis and trial and error, they had the best possible chance of survival. Not a guarantee, not even odds in their favour on some missions, but the best chance available in circumstances where there were no good choices, only choices that killed you faster or slower. The legacy of the combat box extended beyond the specific formation itself. It represented a way of thinking about complex problems that would characterize American military doctrine for decades. The idea that systematic analysis, mathematical precision, and rigorous training could provide solutions to problems that appeared insoluble. The belief that technology and tactics, properly applied, could minimize casualties even in the most dangerous operations. The understanding that individual heroism, while admirable, was less important than systemic approaches that maximized the effectiveness of ordinary men doing extraordinary things. Curtis LeMay's career embodied this approach. He was not a charismatic leader who inspired men through force of personality. He was an engineer who solved problems through analysis and discipline. He demanded the utmost from his men because he demanded the utmost from himself. He led the most dangerous missions because he would not ask men to do what he would not do. And he absolutely believed that proper preparation, relentless training, attention to detail, systematic problem-solving, was the difference between life and death. The combat box over Europe in World War II was proven effective at costs measured in thousands of lives. Whether those costs were justified remains a question historians and ethicists continue to debate. The strategic bombing campaign that the combat box enabled caused massive destruction in Germany. Factories were destroyed, transportation networks were shattered, cities were reduced to rubble. Hundreds of thousands of civilians died. The military effectiveness of the campaign has been questioned by some historians who argue that Germany continued producing war materials at high rates despite the bombing and that the resources devoted to the campaign might have been better used elsewhere. But for the men who flew in the combat boxes, these were not theoretical questions. They were fighting a war against an enemy who had conquered most of Europe, who was systematically murdering millions of civilians, who had to be defeated regardless of cost. They did what they were ordered to do. They flew the missions, they held the formations, they dropped the bombs, and they died in numbers that would be unacceptable in any modern military operation. In the end, the combat box succeeded in its immediate tactical purpose. It increased the survivability of American bomber formations, operating in the most hostile airspace ever created. It allowed the daylight precision bombing campaign to continue when losses threatened to make it unsustainable. It contributed to the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany, though the relative contribution of strategic bombing versus other factors, the Soviet advance from the east, the Allied invasion of France, the naval blockade, the oil campaign remains debated. What is not debatable is that thousands of young Americans climbed into B-17s day after day and flew into fire, believing that the formations they flew would give them the best chance to survive and complete their mission. The combat box gave them that chance. Not a good chance, not even a fair chance on some missions, but a chance where none had existed before. And sometimes, in war, that is all you can ask for. A chance. A set of procedures that work more often than they fail. A system that saves more lives than it costs. Mathematics applied to the problem of survival in circumstances where survival seems impossible. The flying porcupine. 700 guns firing in coordinated patterns calculated to provide no safe approach. Young men holding formation while their world exploded around them. Discipline in the face of terror. Trust in mathematics and in each other. It worked, at terrible cost, but it worked. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.